Okay. Right. Kia ora koutou, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for coming. My name is Kareem Dickey and I'm the chair of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs Wellington branch. The New Zealand Institute of Affairs is a non-government organisation which provides an independent and non-partisan platform on international affairs and their impact on New Zealand. Tonight we're delighted to be hosting Dr. Iati Iati. Dr. Iati is a consultant and lecturer. He received his PhD in political science from the University of Hawaiʻi Mānoa. His major research interest is governance in the Pacific, focusing on issues of political accountability, the work of civil society in enhancing good governance, and the political implications of land reform. Dr. Iati holds a matai title from the village of Falelatai in Samoa. Dr. Iati joined Victoria University of Wellington in 2019 from the University of Otago, where he was a senior lecturer in the Department of Politics and a co-director for the 48th and 50th Otago Foreign Policy schools. His presentation tonight is titled Assessing the Pacific Reset. Following his presentation, we'll open the floor to questions, and just as a courtesy, we ask if you'd give your name and affiliation. And just finally, before I hand over, we are taking down names just at the front for COVID tracing reasons. So if you haven't registered, if you could please fill in that at the end, that would be appreciated. Thank you. So I'll hand over to you now, Doctor.
Okay, great. Thanks. All right. Kia ora tātou. Good afternoon. And whaatalo whātua tātou awhia ne awhiawhi. I'd like to thank NZIAA for the invitation to give this presentation. I have a lot of material to cover, so I'm going to shoot straight into it. When I was writing up the presentation, I wasn't sure where to pitch it at, what level to pitch it at. I assumed that most people who were going to attend already knew about the Pacific Reset. Talking to some folks, though, it seems like maybe some people haven't quite read enough about the Pacific Reset. So I've just put up this picture of when Winston gave a talk in Auckland about the Pacific Reset, and hopefully that's enough of an introduction for the Pacific Reset for the other folks. Basically, it's a new direction in New Zealand foreign policy. Involves a little bit of extra money, 700 million plus, a bigger diplomatic footprint, I think 50 new posts, 14 of those dedicated to the Pacific. Because I got a lot of material, I hope that suffices for a short introduction to the Pacific Reset, which Winston Peters announced a couple of years ago. All right. So before I begin, and also I hope you'll forgive me, I'm going to stick to the script because I know I've only got like about 40 minutes and I've got a lot of material.
Don't talk too fast.
Thank you for saying that, because I was just about to really talk fast, but thank you for reminding me. So before I begin, I'm going to set out what I'm not going to do in this talk. Okay, I don't have access to specific data or the latest data about the implementation of the reset, so it's going to be difficult for me to provide an analysis along that front. I have heard stories from people in the Pacific about how this is going, etc., but I didn't want to use sort of a lot of anecdotes as the basis for the presentation. So people at MFAT are going to know the ins and outs. They're going to know how the programs are going. I'm not here to talk about that. What I am here to talk about is the key tenets of the reset. Okay, and there are any number to choose from, but the ones I'm interested in are whether the reset should be focusing on countering China's influence in the region. And then I want to examine the underlying principle of the reset, moving away from a donor-recipient model to a partnership model. And then I want to look at whether more money and more diplomats is a solution for New Zealand trying to peg back the influence that it thinks it's lost. And finally, I'll look at New Zealand's so-called Pacific identity and how it fits or should fit into the reset. So those are the four things I'm going to focus on, okay? None of the nitty-gritty details that the ministries will obviously be more familiar with than I am. In order to do this, from the outset, I'm going to establish that one of the goals of the reset is to counter China. Now, although most observers of Pacific geopolitics assume that this is the key purpose of the reset. We've had conflicting messages from the government, from Mr. Peters. Some of his statements directly dispute that the reset is to counter China. Look, I'm not privy to all the discussions, but from an outsider's perspective, when you look at the narrative and the policy surrounding the reset, it's difficult to draw any other conclusion that one, if not the main goal, is to counter China. So let's start then with the countering China aspect of it. Is the Pacific reset aimed at countering China and its influence in the Pacific? So the New Zealand government hasn't directly said that that is the reset's purpose, but if you were to listen to some of Mr. Peters' rhetoric, I'd suggest that's really the goal. To start off with, Mr. Peters has strongly denied that the reset is, and he quotes, specifically to counter China. In a 2018 Radio New Zealand interview, he explained that the reset is designed to ensure that the shape and character of our neighbourhood maintains the level of influence of countries who believe in democracy, who believe in sovereignty, and countries who have got the best interests of the neighbourhood in mind, not some wider, larger purpose. Now, where it gets interesting is that in 2018, there was a report by Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Some of you guys may have read this report. It's called Chinese Influence in American Interests. And in that report, New Zealand was said to be vulnerable to Chinese influence, and that China appears ready to exploit New Zealand's pursuance of closer ties with it to subvert New Zealand's continued ability to independently shape its policy priorities. In a 2018 Radio New Zealand interview, the following was put to Mr. Peters. It, referring to the Stanford report, goes on to say that New Zealand has long pursued ties with China. But what is changing is the willfulness with which China appears to exploit the dynamic with New Zealand and to subvert New Zealand's continued ability to independently shape its policy priorities. What are you doing as Foreign Minister to counter that? And Peters replied, you know what I'm doing to counter that. The first thing we did when we became a government and I became Foreign Minister was set out to evaluate what had gone on, and that's why we've got the Pacific reset, which is a huge turnaround in our approach to our neighborhood and our engagement with it, and our engagement in it, and our engagement with each and every government in the Pacific, and also those players such as Japan, Australia, etc. Now, in the same year, Mr. Peters gave a speech at the Lowy Institute. The Lowy Institute is considered probably the #1 independent research institute in the Southern Hemisphere. I think the New Zealand Centre for Strategic Studies up in Vic is probably close #2, but Lowy is very highly rated. And so Mr. Peters gave this speech at Lowy, and he stated that the New Zealand government is undergoing a Pacific reset. If you look closely at Mr. Peters' speech and the subsequent rhetoric, you'll have come away with no other conclusion, but the reset looks like it's really focusing on China. So in that Lowy speech, Mr. Peters stated that the Pacific has also become increasingly contested strategic space, no longer neglected by great power ambition, and so Pacific leaders have more options. This is creating a degree of strategic anxiety. Now, this begs the question, which great power or great powers are creating strategic anxiety for New Zealand? Well, a simple process of elimination based on common sense suggests it is China. China, the US, and France are the only great powers that are active in this region. And of these three, China is the relative newcomer. France and the US have long histories as colonizers in this region and continue to control their dependencies, and in the case of the US, their compact of free association states. As such, it would not make sense that France and the US are the ones that Peters is referring to as having great power ambition in the region. And it'd be highly surprising if New Zealand was strategically anxious about the activities of the Americans. New Zealand wants more and not less United States involvement in this region. France has its own gig in the region. And even though its dependencies are now getting more involved in regionalism, we're talking here about French Polynesia, etc., countering France would seem the least of New Zealand's concerns. So, if not the United States and France, then who? Well, could it be the UK? No offense to the UK, but it's not exactly a big actor in the region anymore. While it has opened up 3 diplomatic posts in the region, that doesn't put it in the race for regional hegemon. My colleague at Vic, Professor John Frankel, noted in 2018 about the opening of these 3 diplomatic posts. It's an attempt to ramp up a diplomatic presence, which is, I suppose, a good thing after an era where Britain has withdrawn. But I don't really see the connections with the island states figuring in a major way in British foreign policy in the future. It's too far away and its interests aren't there. I think there's some truth to what John was saying. And even if the UK was intending to ramp up its presence, I can't see any reasons why New Zealand would be opposed to this. So where does that leave us? China and Russia. To be sure, Russia has popped up now and then on the regional geopolitical radar with some of the things they've been doing in West Papua and with Fiji. Sending a Russian naval ship to PNG on a goodwill mission before the APEC meeting probably got some pundits excited. But is it reasonable to believe that these activities are sufficient to get New Zealand strategically anxious? Probably not. So where does that leave us? China. China is the only great power that New Zealand could possibly be strategically anxious about. So that is the first tenet, which I will examine later, of the Pacific Reset. What are the other tenets? So apart from countering China, the other one I'd like to point out is that New Zealand is moving away from a donor-recipient model to one based on partnership. And Mr. Peters and other members of the foreign policy community have made this clear. If you were here at the New Zealand Institute for International Affairs conference last October, was anyone here for that? Where Mr. Peters spoke, for those who attended and were paying attention, you might recall him saying, we're moving away from the donor-recipient dynamics of the past, building more mature relationships with Pacific Island countries. The message that New Zealand is a partner and not just a donor has resonated in the region and enabled frank conversations about shared policy priorities and challenges. So that's the other tenet I'm going to examine. The third one is New Zealand is focusing on a back-to-basics diplomacy, which means greater engagement with Pacific governments, which involves budgetary increase and an increase in New Zealand's diplomatic footprint in the region. And according to Peters, this is going to demonstrate New Zealand's commitment to the region, allowing New Zealand to do more in relation to issues such as climate change, good governance, human rights, women's political development, etc. The other tenet I want to look at is this message that New Zealand is a Pacific country. And I think this is where it kind of gets interesting. Obviously, New Zealand adopted this identity a while ago, but it is key to the Pacific Reset for a number of reasons, none more so than that New Zealand needs to emphasize the partnership dimension. Now, I'll talk about the historical aspects of the identity later and issues with pushing this narrative. For now, I just want to draw your attention to the fact we've got this Pacific identity, and depending on how you use it, it could help or hinder your objectives in the region. So our foreign ministers always proudly flying the Pacific flag, got considerable traction out of it. If we remember the last time we made it onto the UN Security Council as a non-permanent member, on the mantra that New Zealand would represent small countries like those in the region, we've got good traction out of it. And following this tradition, Mr. Peters has made the point of highlighting our Pacific identity. And what is that identity? Well, in the same speech he gave to you guys last year, he said New Zealand is a Pacific country, linked by history, culture, politics, and demographics. As part of the Pacific family, New Zealand is deeply conscious that our identity, our national security, and our prosperity are inextricably linked. We have, in a very genuine sense, a shared Pacific destiny. Now, a number of government documents are going to say the same thing. If you read the 2018 redacted cabinet paper, it says a similar thing, except now that we're a Polynesian country. So we're not just a Pacific country, we're a Polynesian country. That appears to make a little bit more sense than saying we're Pacific. Okay. Now let's do the assessment. China focus. Should the reset be aiming to counter China's influence? This all depends on how much influence New Zealand wants to maintain in the region. If New Zealand wants the influence it enjoyed before, as per Mr. Peters' narrative, then it must be focused on China. And there are two key reasons for this. First, as we all know, China's influence in the Pacific has grown. Nearly 2 decades now, it's been common knowledge Pacific leaders have increasingly turned to China for assistance, for friendship, and according to the late Ron Krokum, in order to massage their egos. In turn, China has responded positively. The lavish reception of Pacific leaders, unconditional aid, low-interest loans, and other special treatments have proved very popular with Pacific governments. Is it any wonder that by the early 2000s, John Henderson and Ben Riley were making statements such as this? It is now accepted routine that the first official overseas visit by a new head of government from the region is made to Beijing, not to Canberra, Washington, or Wellington. And it makes you kind of think, if it was accepted routine back then, well, what is it now? And it's an interesting question, but not one for this presentation. Importantly, China's rise has occurred at a time when it appears that New Zealand and its allies have become complacent in their relationship with the Pacific Island countries. And this is why you have this whole sort of benign neglect narrative, floating around in relation to how Western allies have treated their Pacific neighbors. Now, there is some debate about how valid this narrative is. I guess the counter-narrative to that is Richard Herr's 2019 publication about Chinese soft power in the region. But I'd say that most people agree something to the effect of benign neglect has taken place in this region. Perhaps what is most important for us is to ask is, how do Pacific Islanders or Pacific Islands countries view this issue? Do they think that there's been benign neglect? Now, this might be worth researching, but anecdotally, this view does exist in the region. Samoan Prime Minister Tuilaepa Malielegaoi has identified, quote, a patronizing nuance in believing that Pacific nations did not know what they were doing. One has the tendency to be bemused by the fact that the reaction is an attempt to hide what we see as strategic neglect. And I think it's kind of interesting how he doesn't frame it as benign neglect, he says it's strategic neglect. So when you say strategic neglect, obviously there are connotations of this being a deliberate policy approach by the Western aid donors. At least that's how Tuilaepa is viewing it. And you have to remember, Tuilaepa Malielegaoi is probably one of New Zealand's closest friends in the region. When New Zealand was running up against Bainimarama, and Bainimarama was saying, kick New Zealand, Australia out of the forum, there was one leader standing for New Zealand, and that was Tuilaepa. So when you get one of your closest friends, if not your closest friend in the region, saying, hey, we see you guys, we know the strategic neglect's been going on, I think it's time to pay attention. So, whether it's benign neglect or strategic neglect, some form of neglect has been perceived in the Pacific. And as we all know, perception is critical in international relations. Now, the second reason why you really want to focus on China is China's growing influence has resulted in a relative decrease in New Zealand's influence. and the influence of his allies. Geopolitical influence is always relative. The amount of influence a country has depends on the influence of others. But it's not just the influence of anyone else, which could diminish New Zealand's influence in this region. It's the fact that it's China whose influence is growing. We don't mind if Australians and the Americans, if their influence is growing, but the fact that it's China is what makes it troubling. If China wasn't around, New Zealand's influence probably would not be affected, regardless of whether it continued to neglect the region or not. But China is here and most likely not going anywhere, especially given the geopolitical implications of COVID-19. That's not my presentation, so I won't talk about it here, but if you think through the geopolitical implications of COVID for this region, China, if I was advising the Chinese, you've got a lot of opportunities right now. You've got countries who are struggling in facilities and infrastructure that are up for grabs. Make the most of your opportunity. In any way, that's a different presentation. More importantly, from a geopolitical context perspective, China is playing a very good game in this region. You know, I've got to tip my hat off to the Chinese. I don't think any country has played the geopolitical game as good as Chinese. According to aid data released by the Lowy Institute, for much of the last 2 decades, China was probably ranked 5th to 6th on the list of aid donors to the region. Australia has been consistently number 1. Then you have United States and New Zealand being the other major country donors. And despite that, China's influence has risen to the point that it has warranted a response via the reset and Australia's step up. So, gotta take your hat off to China. They've done exceedingly well. Number 5, number 6 on the list has taken on number 1 and 2. It goes without saying that countries have to pay in order to play the Pacific geopolitical game. It's part and parcel of trying to get influence. That's why aid, and I tell this to all my students, aid is a political tool first and foremost. It's not a humanitarian or development tool first and foremost, it is a political tool. After a country pays for the right to play, it must then employ an effective strategy or game plan. And in this regard, China has paid less, but has achieved relatively more. One has to conclude and give China some kind of recognition for how well it's played this game. So if New Zealand wants to maintain the level of influence it believes is necessary to further its interests in the Pacific, it has little choice but to try and counter China's rising influence. Now, how it should do this is a topic for another presentation, but I believe there are ways to counter China, or at the very least, there are ways not to make it easier for China to gain more influence in this region. I've seen some policies from the Western countries in this region, and all I can see is they are actually laying out, making it easier for China to get greater influence. I'm surprised people are not thinking through some of these policies, and it has to do with making it easier for Chinese business people to get a foothold in some of these countries. We're advocating policies that are allowing this to happen. But that's a topic for another conversation. Let's look at the donor-recipient to partnership. The donor-recipient to partnership move, the issue here is not whether this is the right move or not. It goes without saying that this is absolutely the right thing to do. You'd have to be a nincompoop to think otherwise. Why? Well, firstly, we need to do some decoding. What does donor-recipient mean? Anyone want to hazard a guess? Well, to start with, it certainly doesn't mean partnership, right? Because New Zealand is moving to a partnership model. So that raises the question, what was New Zealand doing up until the reset? It is implicit in Mr. Peters' words that up until the reset, New Zealand did not view or treat these countries as partners. So if not partners, then what kind of relationship did we have? Well, I would argue that the donor-recipient term is a code word for a neo-colonial relationship. And we're trying to move away from that. And if it's not a code word, then certainly it appears to be what's happening in the Pacific over the last few decades, particularly if you look at aid conditionality, if you look at New Zealand and Australia's influence in regionalism. So the power imbalance between New Zealand and Australia on the one hand and the PRCs on the other, like everyone knows this. New Zealand and Australia have exercised influence in the region in proportion to the money that they've given. And you wouldn't expect them to do anything else. But the move from neocolonialism towards partnerships is a real no-brainer. And for this reason, Pacific Island countries now have much greater autonomy in their international affairs than they had previously. And they are exercising this autonomy more boldly than they did in the past. We all know this. But here it's important to make a distinction between autonomy and sovereignty. Okay? Now they've had sovereignty for decades. But gaining sovereignty, having sovereignty, is a necessary but not sufficient factor for getting autonomy. Autonomy is different. Independent countries can be limited from doing what they want by any number of factors. Okay, so you can wave the whole sovereignty flag around, but you can be subject to conditions put in your aid, for example. And PICs, until the late 1990s and early 2000s, had been limited in the exercise of their autonomy. Financial constraints combined with a lack of real alternatives in aid donors meant that PICs, Pacific Island countries, were susceptible to the agendas and policies of traditional benefactors such as New Zealand and Australia. And that's why you have aid conditionality being a mainstay of the relationship between these countries and the PICs. And where do we see this aid conditionality manifest? We saw it bilaterally, where PICs had to accept much of the advice and policy of the relevant donor. We saw it multilaterally with the imposition of an Australian and New Zealand agenda on Pacific regionalism, manifest in such things as the Pacific Plan. I'm sorry if you don't know what the Pacific Plan was. Some of you might recall it was prompted by Helen Clark's government, but then put into effect by the Australians. By the end of the last decade, Pacific Island countries appear to have found greater autonomy to resist the agendas of their traditional benefactors. So that's why now you hear of Pacific Island countries having agency, expressed through such things as the Blue Pacific narrative, etc. Make no mistake about it, China has been the key player in giving Pacific Island countries an alternative and greater space to exercise their autonomy. I'm going to break from my script now and tell a little story. I was having dinner with a Pacific Island leader, and he said he was having dinner with one of the, I won't say whether it's Australia or New Zealand, anyway. So the other Prime Minister says to this Prime Minister from the Pacific, are you guys hosting something with the UN in 2020? He said, yeah, we are. And so the other Prime Minister says to the Pacific Island leader, oh, that's a shame. And the Pacific Island leader turns around, why is that? And she said to the Pacific Island leader, well, you know, we would have funded you, but we're hosting another UN meeting in 2021. And this Pacific Island Prime Minister turned around to the Metropolitan leader and said, don't worry, we have many friends. So he was telling me this over dinner, and I guess his message was, you know, gone are those days when we're really dependent on one or two or a few sources for financial aid. We got a lot of friends we can call on now. So in this context, it is critical that New Zealand treat PICs as partners and not as aid recipients. That's why I said it's a no-brainer to do this move. The question that always kind of comes to me is, in making this move, is why did it take so long? I mean, China has, at least in rhetoric, employed a partnership model in their dealings with the PICs for decades. You hear it with South-South cooperation. China's mantra coming to the Pacific was, we're a developing country, you're a developing country, we know what you need, what you want, what your perspectives are. And the nice thing about China is they've acted accordingly. They may not understand all the cultural, traditional things about the Pacific, but they at least had, in rhetoric at least, the common sense to say, let's try to create sort of inequality in our relationship with these folks, at least in rhetoric. So if PRCs can, and everyone knows this, they're going to rebuff a neocolonial approach. Now, I often hear that Chinese aid is popular because it goes towards large, visible projects, such as government buildings and hospitals and sports stadiums. And I hear that it's popular because China is in cahoots with corrupt government officials, etc., etc. I'm not going to affirm or deny those arguments, but one thing I can say is that in letting PICs decide how aid is used, China is doing something that PICs have long wanted from aid donors: respect their right to determine their future and what is best for them. It doesn't take a genius to work out, after you've been as a colony under colonialism for about 6 decades of the 1900s, the one thing you're going to really try to protect once you get independence is your sovereignty and your autonomy. China came along and said, look, as long as you remember the one China policy, we're good to go from there. And the PICs were good to go from there. So when PICs found themselves in a position where they could rebuff aid conditionality, what did people think they would do? So they've drawn closer to the country that has given them this option. So in this context, how much influence New Zealand can peg back by moving to a partnership model, that's going to be interesting to keep track of. One thing is certain, it would be in New Zealand's interest to back up rhetoric with substance. Okay? Mr. Peters has talked the talk. Can he walk the walk? Unfortunately, when I go through some of his speeches, it looks like we may be heading into some problems. In his Lowy speech, Mr. Peters sent out a contradictory message of sorts, and he stated, in navigating a more complex strategic environment, New Zealand's view is that we must be respectful of Pacific Island countries and clear ways to manage their own international relations, while at the same time retain New Zealand's traditional emphasis on human rights, etc. Our wish is that accountability across the Pacific embodies these tenets, because we know that good leadership is good government, and what we need is more good political leadership to lift performance across the region. Then he went on to say, but make no mistake, isolation and a lack of size is no excuse for failing to strive for the best standards. And that is a message we must give clearly through the Pacific from end to end. Being small and isolated is no excuse for failing to strive for the very best. So, when I read this, I was thinking, do you want to respect Pacific Island countries' sovereignty and autonomy, or is it the same old neo-colonial wine in new wineskins? I don't even know why Mr. Peters would put in this kind of statement into his speech. Who in their right minds thinks that being small and isolated correlates with failing to strive for best standards? It kind of defeats all the aforementioned sentiments about respecting Pacific Island countries. You can achieve the same goals without coming up with a contradictory speech that says, oh, forget all the BS before the but. So his statement was puzzling to say the least. In any case, this gets to another issue. At what point do you cross from respecting Pacific Island countries' autonomy and sovereignty to emphasizing what New Zealand expects from Pacific Island countries? Here it's interesting. To those who don't understand these issues, human rights, transparency, good governance, and democracy, they are not straightforward things to achieve. Just go have a look at the Solomon Islands, where we tried the top-down good governance model. If we take good governance, for example, when the so-called good governance agenda and narrative became popular in the 1990s and 2000s, My former mentor and supervisor, Professor John Henderson, was very suspicious about what it meant and who it would benefit, particularly in the Pacific. And so he ended up penning an article called Good Governance, Good for Who? I was an MA student at the time, and I unsuccessfully tried to follow his lead and penned a similar article called Good Governance, Good for What? My paper obviously paled in comparison to John's, but the message was the same. Anyone familiar with debates about good governance and democracy can tell you these are loaded terms and mean different things to different peoples and societies. The same could be said for democracy. How it manifests in one society may not be how it manifests in others. Samoa's version of the Westminster system is an example. Hopefully you're familiar with that example. If New Zealand thinks it's going to impose things like good governance and democracy in the Pacific in a manner and form that it understands, but which doesn't take into account Pacific Island country histories, cultures, traditions, and so forth, then I think ultimately the Pacific Reset may not achieve the government's goals. You're headed for failure. I'll explain why in a minute. If Mr. Peters is serious about making the Pacific Reset work, he might want to carefully examine and understand how culture and traditions factor into things like governance and democracy and human rights. So my point is, we have to be really careful about the promotion of these things. If we really say we're going to respect their sovereignty, we might want to back that up with a bit of substance instead of pushing too hard for some of these things that we say are necessary. How about more diplomats and money? Is this necessary? Well, increasing the diplomatic footprint in the Pacific won't necessarily guarantee results. If you're simply going to have more people do the same thing you've been doing in the past, your outcome's going to be different? Probably not. It would appear that one of the issues with New Zealand's Pacific engagement in the past has been its lack of attention to diplomatic integrity. And I don't want to offend anybody, but Michael Poles and Anna Poles had a really good piece in New Zealand International Review on this called Time for a Reset, where they explained, and of course those of you familiar with Michael knows his background in the diplomatic corps, and Michael explains how diplomats, while diplomats designated to regions such as Asia and Europe, were usually equipped with relevant language and cultural training, the same wasn't expected for those going to the Pacific. And Michael and Anna noted that New Zealand diplomats to other regions were expected to have greater expertise in those regions, in their languages, etc., than those sent to the Pacific. Furthermore, while in most other regions it is usual practice to appoint, quote, senior New Zealand diplomats with training and professional experience in the field of diplomacy, the same wasn't done for the Pacific. Now, if that really is the case, and I tend to believe what Michael's saying to a large extent, I find it kind of puzzling if that's your approach, right? Because you're pouring about 60% of your aid into this region, but then don't quite back it up with the same diplomatic effort. And then you wonder, why are we losing influence? Why are we getting the results we want? Now, we don't know whether Pacific leaders even care about whether New Zealand treats its diplomatic assignments to the Pacific in the same way it does to other regions. But if there's one thing I know about the Pacific, is that cultural competency can get you considerable respect in this region. It's important for New Zealand to understand that in the Pacific, the importance of culture and tradition cannot be overstated. And on this point, I'm reminded of the Eminent Persons Group. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Eminent Persons Group. If you're familiar with the Pacific Plan, before the Pacific Plan came out, they had an EPG group headed by former Prime Minister of PNG, Julius Chan, and they went around the Pacific and they canvassed the Pacific to see what was most important to Pacific Island countries. Was it security? Was it trade? Anyone guess what their report concluded was the most important thing to Pacific Island countries? Culture and traditions. Not security, not trade, not economics. Unfortunately, when the EPG report was filtered through the Pacific Plan, that got lost in the translation, and if you read the Pacific Plan, culture is about maybe number 4 or 5 down the list. But in any case, the move to have more diplomats in this region may not make a difference, but a move to have more culturally competent diplomats might make a difference. And I'm not saying that the ones currently deployed are not, but I think we really need to take stock of what is our diplomatic footprint in this region. Do we really understand the region? Are we able to engage them culturally, traditionally, etc.? I have a number of anecdotal stories I could tell you where culture comes into play in these things, but I just don't have the time to do it right now. What about the extra $700 million going to the reset? Well, I'd like to make first 2 points about this. The first, I think, would be, as I mentioned earlier, New Zealand has used its aid to the Pacific as a tool to control and influence the region. And I'm not saying this is right or wrong. In fact, if you ask me as a realist, it makes every sense New Zealand should use their aid in this way. Use it as a political tool, but you got to use it smartly as a political tool, right? I think most normal countries use their aid as a political tool, first and foremost. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't have some unselfish sentiments attached to this aid, and that there's no measure of genuinely wanting to help these countries. Of course, we have that, but aid is primarily a political tool. That may not surprise most of you, but interestingly, I've come across some people in foreign policy circles who genuinely get shocked when I say, isn't our aid primarily used as a political tool? There was some reports back in the 1990s where they made this clear. I don't have time to read those out for you now, but Professor John Henderson has covered it a bit in his readings. So let's be clear about what aid is for. Second, more money is not always going to get you results. It's how you deploy that money. Which countries can we learn this lesson from? You can learn it from Australia. Consistently the largest aid donor to the region, yet it is doubtful that it now has the most influence to this region. Okay. You can learn it from China, consistently number 5 or 6. But as I mentioned earlier, they knew how to use their aid effectively. And I'm not talking about non-conditional aid, paying corrupt officials, etc. China spoke the language of Pacific governments with their aid. So just a couple of points to note about how we're using our aid. Finally, I'd like to go down to the identity, and I'm sorry I'm running a little bit over time. As we all know, New Zealand's Pacific identity came to the fore in 1973 with the Kirk government. Made sense. Britain was heading to the EEC. New Zealand's that was really New Zealand's last significant ties to Europe. More importantly, at the time, the Pacific was becoming independent. And after decades of treating the region as a collection of colonies, New Zealand and its allies needed a new strategy to deal with sovereign countries. So New Zealand needed to be part of the region in the sense of being a Pacific country as opposed to being a metropolitan country operating in the region. Importantly, it needed to be part of the emerging Pacific regionalism with Pacific Island Producers Association preceding the South Pacific Forum. Now, that's when we saw the Pacific identity kind of come out in our foreign policy. But as many of us may or may not know, there were issues with New Zealand's Pacific identity. It always sounded good in rhetoric, but it's questionable whether it existed in substance. I don't know if you're familiar with Gerard Hensley, former New Zealand diplomat, head of the Prime Minister's department under 2 administrations, and he has a book out called Friendly Fire. And Mr. Hensley has this nice quote for us, talking about the emerging Pacific identity back in the 70s. The new emphasis on the South Pacific, however, was no more than a polite fiction. Revealingly, politicians and diplomats who carried the message of New Zealand's Pacific identity to foreign governments rarely confirmed their words by wanting a posting there. I wonder how much has changed. The Pacific was a convenient or inconvenient means to an end. Mr. Hensley goes on to say, the stress on the South Pacific was a fig leaf to cover a more fundamental withdrawal from the world. So we've had a Pacific identity for a while, but what exactly it means and what it means to New Zealand foreign policy is still up for debate. Now, I want to make sure to say that New Zealand has every right to fly the Pacific identity flag for all the reasons Mr. Peters has identified. But we really have to grapple with the question of, well, what does this Pacific identity really mean? And does it continue to be used as described by Mr. Hensley? Is New Zealand's Pacific identity a convenient geopolitical diplomatic tool? Furthermore, is New Zealand really a Pacific Island country in the same way that Pacific Island countries are? Perhaps a more important question is, do Pacific Island countries and peoples in the region see New Zealand as one of them, or as a European metropolitan power operating in the Pacific? I think these questions really had to be looked at closely. What we know is that for a long time, the PICs did not view New Zealand as one of them. Same with Australia. Rather, they viewed New Zealand as a regional metropolitan power. And here I got a nice quote from Brian Tokelau and Fraser's book, where they talk about how Ratu Sukamase Samara had warned foreign leaders before he left power, talking about the threat that the metropolitan powers, New Zealand and Australia, could pose for the region. And you can sort of see in the statement that these leaders, himself and Noel Levy, who was the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat around that time, you can see they didn't view New Zealand as part of the Pacific Island countries, but as metropolitan aid donors. And I'm just going to finish off quickly now. Their sentiments, I don't think really much has changed that much from what they said. No one has rammed home this point better than Fiji's Prime Minister Frank Bainimarama, when in 2016 he called for the ousting of Australia and New Zealand from the PIF on the basis, quote, they are not Pacific Islanders, end quote. That was Bainimarama. Then, of course, Fiji backed this up by forming the PIDF, which excluded Australia and New Zealand. Now, some might recall that in 2015, in response to Bainimarama, John Key said this: a Pacific Forum without Australia and New Zealand would be an interesting thing, I suppose, and that those leaders would be able to talk about things. But exactly where they would get the money to do anything, And the answer is nowhere. Well, the Samoan Prime Minister, Tula Epa, completely agreed with Mr. Key. And he had this to say: the forum is made up of 14 very poor nations, and then these two nations, New Zealand and Australia, who fund the plans by these 14 very poor nations. Now, John Key is right. He has hit the mark, because that's why New Zealand and Australia came in. They fund our stuff. Well, what can you say? The man has a way with words, right? But interestingly, in trying to defend New Zealand and Australia, Tula Epa implied the same point Ratu Mara and Noel Levy had made. Key is implying the same thing as well. New Zealand and Australia are seen as the money men for the region. So how do PICs view New Zealand? Is it one of them, or just another donor that funds their stuff? If it's the latter, how does this bode for New Zealand trying to move away from the donor-recipient framework to the partnership framework? Let me conclude with this. If New Zealand wants to be all the things it says in its statements about its Pacific identity, it's going to have to demonstrate a real understanding of the region, not just an academic understanding of it. There's a reason why the late Ratu Kamasese Mara coined the phrase, the Pacific Way. I don't know if you've heard of that. It's coined a few decades ago. It was a code word that Pacific leaders and Pacific Islanders understand to mean they have a different world. That their world is made up of unspoken but understood norms, values, and principles that tie Pacific peoples together. And these often go unspoken, but they dictate how one acts, speaks, and so forth in particular forums and within certain relationships. If New Zealand is really serious about its Pacific identity, then it needs to tap into this world. But that requires genuine respect for what the Pacific considers important, not just paying lip service to Pacific sovereignty, only to end things by saying, but make no mistake, isolation, a lack of size is no excuse for failing to strive for the best of standards. Well, make no mistake, Mr. Peters, if you take that approach, you pretty much lost before you've started. I'll end it there.